The door of the cottage flew open before Clara Whitfield could reach it, and a tall man in a dark riding coat stepped inside without asking permission. His eyes were hard, his jaw tight, and his gloved hand gripped a folded letter as if he meant to crush it. Clara stepped back, startled, her heart pounding at the sight of him standing in her small kitchen like a storm that had wandered indoors. She knew him at once. Duke Edmund Ashcombe, the man who owned nearly every field, every cottage, and every soul for miles around Hollow Brook. She had seen him from a distance many times, riding past on his black horse, never once looking her way. Now he filled her doorway, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavy under his stare. "You will tell me the truth," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "or I will see you dragged before a magistrate before the sun sets." Clara's hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron. "Your Grace, I do not understand. What truth do you want from me? Do not play the innocent." He stepped closer, and she could smell the rain still clinging to his coat. "My son is dead, my only heir, and I have been told that you know more about how it happened than you have ever admitted." The words struck her like a blow. She had heard, of course, that young Julian Ashcombe had died in a riding accident weeks before, thrown from his horse on the road near the eastern woods. The whole village had grieved for the boy, barely 20 years old, full of laughter and kindness whenever he passed through Hollow Brook. Clara herself had wept quietly the night she heard the news, remembering how he used to stop and speak with the village children, herself included, years ago. "I know nothing of what happened to your son beyond what everyone in this village knows," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "He fell from his horse. That is all I was told." "That is not all." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "A groom from my stable says you were seen near the eastern road that morning. He says you spoke with my son not an hour before he died. What did you say to him? What did you give him?" Clara's mind raced backward, trying to remember that morning. She had walked to the market early, as she always did, carrying a basket of eggs to sell. She had not seen Julian Ashcombe that day, not once, and she said so. But the Duke did not seem to hear her. "You worked in my household once," he continued, his voice rising. "A maid, dismissed for reasons my steward never fully explained to me. Now my son is dead on the very road you walk each morning, and you expect me to believe this is nothing more than misfortune? I was a maid in your house for less than a year, Your Grace, many years ago, and I left because my mother grew ill and needed me at home. There was no scandal in it. I have not set foot inside your gates since." Edmund studied her for a long moment, and something flickered behind his hard expression, something Clara could not name. He looked at her, the way a man looks at a puzzle he cannot solve, searching her face for a lie he expected to find but somehow could not. "Then explain to me," he said, quieter now but no less demanding, "why my son's horse was found tied near this very cottage, hours after he was declared dead on the road." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She had not known that. She had heard nothing of a horse near her home, and the accusation now felt like a trap closing around her before she even understood its shape. "I know nothing of any horse," she whispered. "I swear it before anyone you wish to bring as witness." "Swear all you like." "Words are cheap from a woman with nothing left to lose." Edmund's voice hardened again, and he stepped forward until he stood only a pace away from her. "I have half a mind to have you taken to the county jail this very hour, and let the magistrate sort out your innocence, if such a thing exists in you at all." Clara's throat tightened, but she refused to look away from him. Whatever fear lived inside her, she would not let this man see it break her. "Then take me, if that is your wish. But you will find no confession from me, because there is nothing to confess. I did not know your son beyond seeing him pass through the village. I certainly had no hand in his death." For a moment, the two of them simply stood there, the silence between them thick and unbearable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the small cottage, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked at nothing. Edmund's gaze dropped briefly to her hands, still trembling despite her steady words, and something in his expression shifted, though his voice remained cold. "I will not arrest you today," he said finally, "but do not mistake this for mercy. You will come to Ashcombe Hall, where I can watch you and question you properly, away from whatever protection this village believes it offers you. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. If you are guilty, I promise you, there will be no mercy left in me by the time I learn the truth. And if I refuse, you will not refuse." His tone left no room for argument. "I have already sent word to my steward. A carriage will come for you within the hour. Gather what you need. You will not be returning here for some time." Clara wanted to protest, to demand some fairness in this, some chance to defend herself before being carried off like a prisoner to the very house she had once served in as a girl. But she saw in his eyes that no argument would move him, not now, not while his grief was still raw and looking for somewhere to land. She had seen enough of grief in her own life to recognize it wearing the mask of anger. "Very well," she said quietly. "I will come, not because I owe you obedience, Your Grace, but because I have nothing to hide, and I would rather prove that to you than spend my life running from an accusation I do not deserve." Something in her steady defiance seemed to catch him off guard. He looked at her a moment longer, as though seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a suspect but as a woman, standing her ground in her own home despite everything he had thrown at her. Then he turned without another word, and walked out into the gray afternoon, his boots striking hard against the stone path. Clara stood alone in her kitchen, her legs finally giving way as she sank onto a wooden chair. Her hands shook now that no one was watching, and tears she had refused to let fall in front of the Duke slipped freely down her cheeks. She thought of her quiet, simple life, the small comfort she had built for herself after so much loss, and how quickly it had all been threatened by a man's grief and a stranger's rumor. She did not know who had spoken her name to the Duke, or why anyone would claim she had been near that road the morning Julian Ashcombe died. She had never harmed a soul in her life, yet now she would be carried away to a grand house full of servants who would whisper about her, and a grieving father who believed her capable of the worst. She rose after a while and began to gather a few belongings, her movements slow and mechanical. A shawl, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, a small wooden box she kept hidden beneath her bed, containing the only items she had left from her childhood, things she barely understood herself, given to her by the family who raised her, always with a strange reluctance to explain where they had truly come from. As she packed, she caught sight of her own reflection in the small cracked mirror above her washstand. Her eyes were red from crying, her face pale with fear, but there was something steady in her expression too, some quiet strength she did not know she possessed until this moment demanded it. Whatever waited for her at Ashcombe Hall, she would not go there broken. She would go there ready to fight for the truth, even if no one else believed she deserved it. The carriage arrived sooner than she expected, its wheels crunching over the gravel path outside her cottage. A footman in the Duke's livery stepped down and knocked once, his expression carefully blank, offering no comfort and no cruelty either. Clara took one last look at her small home, wondering if she would ever see it again, then stepped outside into the gray afternoon light. The footman said little as he helped her into the carriage, only nodding once when she settled onto the worn leather seat. Clara pressed the small wooden box tight against her chest, as though it might anchor her to something familiar, while everything else in her life spun out of her control. Through the window, she watched Hollowbrook fade behind her, the small stone church, the baker's shop with its crooked sign, the well where she had drawn water every morning since she was a girl. Each landmark passed and vanished, and with it went the last shreds of the quiet life she had built for herself. She thought of her neighbor, old Margaret Blythe, who would surely notice her absence and wonder where she had gone. Margaret had been kind to her over the years, sharing bread when Clara's own supply ran low, listening patiently when loneliness pressed too heavily on her heart. Clara hoped someone would think to tell her what had happened, so she would not simply vanish from the village without explanation. Another whisper added to the many that already followed her name. The road wound past fields she recognized, then through unfamiliar country as the carriage climbed toward the hills where Ashcombe Hall stood, a gray stone giant overlooking the valley below. Clara had not seen the house in years, not since she left her position there as a young maid, and the sight of its towers rising above the trees filled her with a dread she could not fully explain. It was not only fear of the Duke's anger that troubled her, though that alone was enough to unsettle anyone. It was something deeper, some old and buried feeling stirred by the sight of those familiar stone walls, as though a part of her long forgotten recognized the place before her mind could explain why. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself of the promise she had made in her own kitchen only an hour before. She would not arrive at that house broken. Whatever waited for her inside, whatever accusations still hung over her head, she would meet them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every hardship in her life so far. Grief had taught her that much, if nothing else, that a person could survive almost anything if they refused to let fear make their decisions for them. The carriage began to slow as it approached the great iron gates of Ashcombe Hall, and Clara opened her eyes to see them swing open before her, as though the house itself had been waiting for her arrival. She did not yet know that within those walls waited a secret far greater than either she or the grieving Duke imagined, a truth buried deep in old letters and older sorrows, one that would change everything she believed about herself and the family she thought she had lost long ago. Clara had barely stepped through the great doors of Ashcombe Hall when a stern housekeeper took hold of her arm and led her up a narrow servant's staircase, saying nothing beyond a curt instruction to follow quickly. The grandeur of the house pressed down on her, marble floors gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers, portraits of stern ancestors lining the walls, every inch of the place whispering of wealth and power far beyond anything she had known since leaving this house years ago. She remembered some of these halls from her days as a young maid, though back then she had moved through them quietly, unseen, a girl with a mop and bucket rather than a woman accused of murder. The room she was given sat at the far end of a corridor on the third floor, small and plain compared to the grandeur below, but locked from the outside once the housekeeper closed the door behind her. Clara understood the message clearly enough. She was a prisoner here, whatever polite words the Duke had used to describe her situation. She set her small bag and wooden box on the narrow bed and sat beside them, staring at the bare stone walls, wondering how long she would be kept like this, and what proof Edmund Ashcombe expected to find against her. Days passed in a strange rhythm of silence and suspicion. A young maid named Alice brought her meals morning and evening, always glancing nervously toward the door as though afraid of being seen speaking too kindly to the accused woman locked upstairs. Clara tried to draw her into conversation, hoping to learn something of the household, something of what had truly happened to Julian Ashcombe, but Alice remained tight-lipped, offering only frightened glances and quick departures. On the third day, the housekeeper returned with different instructions. The Duke, it seemed, had decided Clara would not simply sit locked away doing nothing. If she was to remain under his roof, she would earn her keep, and perhaps under the watchful eyes of his household staff, some truth would slip free that she had been hiding. Clara did not argue. Any chance to move beyond the narrow walls of her room felt like a mercy, even if it came wrapped in suspicion. She was set to work in the nursery wing, an oddly gentle assignment given the accusations hanging over her, tasked with helping mind the young children of several servants while their mothers attended to other duties around the house. Clara welcomed the work. There was something steadying about the presence of children, their simple joys and small troubles a welcome distraction from the fear that had followed her since the Duke first appeared in her cottage doorway. The children took to her quickly, drawn by her patient nature and the soft way she spoke to them, so different from the sharp tones many of the household staff used when hurried or tired. She read to them from a worn storybook she found on a shelf, mended small tears in their clothing, and comforted a little girl named Sophie who had scraped her knee running too fast across the nursery floor. It was during this small moment of comfort, kneeling to tend to the child's injury, that everything changed. As Clara reached to wipe away Sophie's tears, her sleeve rode up her forearm, exposing a birthmark she had carried since childhood, a pale crescent shape just above her wrist, faint but unmistakable in the afternoon light streaming through the nursery windows. She thought nothing of it, as she never had before. It was simply a part of her, a mark she had grown so used to seeing that she barely noticed it anymore. But across the room, standing in the doorway where he had come to check on the children as he sometimes did since his son's death, Duke Edmund Ashcombe froze completely still. His eyes fixed on the mark with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy. Clara looked up, startled by his sudden presence, and found him staring at her wrist as though he had seen something impossible, something that struck him harder than any accusation he had thrown at her days before. "Your Grace," Clara said carefully, pulling her sleeve back down over her wrist, uncertain what had caused such a dramatic shift in his expression. "Is something wrong?" Edmund did not answer immediately. His face had gone pale, and his hand gripped the doorframe as though he needed it to remain standing. The children, sensing the strange tension in the room, grew quiet, watching the Duke with wide, curious eyes. Finally, he seemed to collect himself, though his voice, when he spoke, carried none of the cold authority Clara had come to expect from him. "Nothing," he said, though the words sounded forced. "Continue with your work." He left the nursery without another word, his footsteps echoing quickly down the corridor, far faster than the measured pace he usually kept. Clara remained kneeling on the floor, Sophie's small hand still resting in hers, utterly confused by what had just happened. She had seen fury in the Duke's eyes before, and cold suspicion, but never anything like the shock and something else, something almost like fear, that had crossed his face in that brief moment. That evening, when Alice brought her supper, the young maid seemed even more nervous than usual, glancing repeatedly at Clara's wrist before quickly looking away. Clara noticed, though she said nothing, filing the strange behavior away alongside the Duke's reaction earlier that day. Something about that birthmark had unsettled the entire household, though no one seemed willing to explain why. Over the following days, Clara noticed a distinct change in how she was treated. The locked door to her room remained locked, but small comforts began appearing without explanation: a softer blanket, better food than the simple meals she had received before. Once, she found a small vase of fresh flowers placed on the narrow table beside her bed, though no one admitted to leaving them there. The hostility that had defined her first days at Ashcombe Hall seemed to be softening into something far more confusing, an uneasy watchfulness that felt almost like concern rather than suspicion. She continued her work in the nursery, careful now to keep her sleeves pulled down over her wrist, though she still did not fully understand why the mark had caused such alarm. The children remained her one true comfort in the strange, tense atmosphere of the house, their innocent laughter a small light against the shadows of grief and accusation that hung over everything else within those walls. One afternoon, while walking back from the nursery to her locked room under the watchful eye of a household guard assigned to escort her, Clara passed by an open door leading into what appeared to be a private study. She caught only a brief glimpse inside, but it was enough to see the Duke seated at a large desk, surrounded by old letters and a faded portrait he held gently in his hands, his expression one of such raw sorrow that Clara nearly stopped walking entirely. The guard urged her forward before she could see more, but the image stayed with her long after her door was locked once again for the night. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning over everything that had happened since her arrival. The birthmark, the Duke's shocked expression, the sudden shift in how she was treated, the portrait he had been holding with such tenderness and grief. None of it made sense on its own, but together, these small strange details felt like pieces of some larger puzzle she could not yet see clearly enough to understand. She thought back to her own childhood, to the family who had raised her, always kind, but always distant when she asked questions about where she had truly come from. Her earliest memories were hazy, fragments of a different house, a different life, before she came to live with the Whitfields as a small girl. They had never explained the circumstances clearly, only telling her that her true parents had been unable to care for her, and that she should be grateful for the home they had given her instead. She had accepted this explanation as a child, too young to question it further, but now, lying awake in a locked room at Ashcombe Hall, old questions she had long since buried began stirring again, refusing to stay quiet any longer. The wooden box she had brought with her sat on the small table beside her bed, containing the only physical connections she had to whatever life she had lived before the Whitfields took her in. A small embroidered handkerchief with initials she had never been able to decipher. A tiny silver ring, far too small for an adult hand, clearly meant for a child, and a folded piece of paper, its ink faded almost to nothing, that she had never been able to read clearly no matter how many times she tried. She rose from her bed and opened the box carefully, running her fingers over these small fragments of a past she barely understood. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder seriously about where she had truly come from, and why a Duke's shocked reaction to a simple birthmark on her wrist had suddenly made those old, buried questions feel more urgent than they ever had before. Somewhere below her, in his private study, Duke Edmund Ashcombe sat awake as well, staring at the faded portrait in his hands, a portrait of a woman he had loved and lost many years ago, before duty and family expectation forced him into a marriage without love. The woman in the portrait had a birthmark just like the one he had glimpsed on Clara's wrist that afternoon, a small crescent shape above the wrist that he had once traced gently with his own fingers during a courtship long since buried beneath years of silence and regret. He did not yet dare to voice the question forming in his mind, a question so impossible and so painful that he could barely allow himself to consider it fully. But as the candle beside him burned low into the night, he knew he would not rest again until he found the answer, whatever the cost, whatever truths it might force him to confront about his own past, and the choices he had made so many years before. The next morning, Edmund summoned his housekeeper, a woman named Margaret who had served the Ashcombe family for over 30 years and knew more of the household secrets than anyone else alive. He asked her, carefully and without explaining his reasons, whether she remembered a woman named Eleanor who had once worked in the gardens many years ago, before his marriage. Margaret's face grew guarded at the mention of the name, and she admitted, reluctantly, that she remembered Eleanor well, and that the young woman had left the estate suddenly one autumn, without any warning or farewell, never to be heard from again. "Do you know where she went?" Edmund asked, his voice tight with something he was trying hard to keep controlled. "No, Your Grace. There were whispers at the time, but nothing certain. Some said she went north to relatives. Others said she simply vanished, unable to bear staying in a place that reminded her of things she wished to forget." Margaret hesitated, studying the Duke's face carefully. "Why do you ask after her now, after all these years?" Edmund did not answer directly. Instead, he asked Margaret to quietly gather whatever old records still existed regarding servants and staff from that period, birth registries from the nearby parish, Anything that might help him trace what had become of a woman he had loved and lost decades before duty forced him into a different life entirely. Margaret agreed, though her eyes carried a question she did not voice aloud, sensing that something significant was stirring beneath her master's careful composure. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Clara continued her days caring for the servants' children, though she found herself distracted, her mind returning again and again to the strange encounter with the Duke and the questions it had stirred within her. She noticed Alice watching her more closely now, and once caught the young maid staring at the wooden box Clara had brought with her, left carelessly open on the table during a rare moment when Clara had stepped away to fetch water for the children. "I did not mean to pry," Alice said quickly when Clara returned and noticed her attention. "It is only that the ring looked familiar to me somehow, though I cannot say why." Clara's heart quickened at these words. "Familiar how? Have you seen one like it before?" Alice shook her head, looking flustered by her own admission. "I could not say for certain. Perhaps I imagined it. Forgive me. I should return to my duties." She hurried from the room before Clara could ask anything further, leaving behind more questions than answers, another small thread in the growing tangle of mystery surrounding Clara's presence at Ashcombe Hall. That evening, as Clara sat alone in her locked room turning the small silver ring over in her fingers, she thought back to her childhood with the Whitfields, trying to recall any detail, however small, that might explain where these items had truly come from. She remembered her adoptive mother's careful evasiveness whenever the subject arose, the way she would change topics quickly, or find sudden chores that needed attention, rather than answer Clara's questions directly. At the time, Clara had assumed this reluctance came from simple discomfort discussing a painful subject, the loss of her birth parents. Now, surrounded by the strange tension of Ashcombe Hall and the Duke's shocked reaction to her birthmark, she began to wonder if there was something else entirely behind her adoptive mother's silence, some deeper secret that had been kept from her all her life. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the weight of so many unanswered questions, and dreamed of a woman she could not quite see clearly, standing in a garden full of roses, humming a soft tune that felt achingly familiar, despite Clara having no memory of ever hearing it before. When she woke the next morning, the dream lingered in her mind like a whisper she could not quite catch, another small piece of a puzzle that seemed to grow larger and stranger with each passing day inside the walls of Ashcombe Hall. The records Margaret gathered arrived on Edmund's desk 3 days later, a small stack of yellowed papers and parish registries that had sat forgotten in a storage room for over 2 decades. Edmund dismissed his housekeeper and locked the study door before sitting down to examine them, his hands unsteady as he turned each page, searching for any mention of the woman he had loved and lost so many years ago. Eleanor Marsh, the name appeared in an old household ledger, listed among the garden staff during the years before his marriage, her wages recorded alongside dozens of other servants long since forgotten by everyone but him. Edmund remembered her clearly despite the passing years, remembered the way sunlight caught her hair when she worked among the roses, the sound of her laughter carrying across the garden on warm summer afternoons, the promises they had whispered to each other before his father discovered their attachment and ended it swiftly and cruelly, arranging Edmund's marriage to a woman of proper standing within a matter of months. He had never known what became of Eleanor after she left the estate. His father had forbidden any mention of her name, and Edmund, young and heartbroken and unable to defy his father's authority, had eventually stopped asking, burying his grief beneath duty and the demands of managing an estate that would one day be entirely his responsibility. He had married, fathered a son, and told himself over the years that the pain of losing Eleanor had faded into something manageable, an old wound that no longer bled. But now, staring at her name in faded ink, and remembering the birthmark he had glimpsed on Clara's wrist, a wound he thought long healed tore open once again, raw and urgent in a way he had not expected. He continued searching through the papers, his heart pounding harder with each page, until he found what he had both hoped and dreaded to find. A parish birth registry, dated almost exactly 9 months after Eleanor's sudden departure from Ashcombe Hall. A daughter, born to a woman listed only as E. Marsh, in a village nearly 50 miles from the estate. No father's name was recorded, only a small notation indicating the child had been given to a family named Whitfield shortly after birth, arrangements made through a solicitor whose name Edmund did not recognize. Whitfield, Clara's family name. Edmund sat back in his chair, the paper trembling in his hands, as the full weight of what he had discovered settled over him like a physical force. Clara was not merely a woman who happened to share a birthmark with the woman he had once loved. Clara was Eleanor's daughter. His daughter, a child he had never known existed, hidden away by his own father's cruel interference, raised by strangers while Edmund lived his life believing he had lost Eleanor entirely, never knowing she had carried a piece of their love forward into the world without him. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, long after the candles burned low, staring at the old records, trying to reconcile the woman he had accused of murder days before with the daughter he now realized he had never known he had. Guilt rose in him like a tide he could not hold back. Guilt for the cruel words he had spoken to her in her own home, for the days he had kept her locked away under suspicion of a crime she could never have committed, for 20 years of a life he had missed entirely without ever knowing it existed. He thought of Julian, his son, dead now these past weeks, and felt a strange new grief layered atop the old one. Julian had a sister he never knew about. Clara had a brother she never knew about, and now that brother was gone before they could ever have met, before Edmund could have found a way to bring his two children together under one roof, however complicated that reunion might have been. The next morning, Edmund summoned Margaret once again, this time asking her directly whether she remembered anything else about Eleanor's departure. Anything about a child that might have been born after she left. Margaret's face paled visibly at the question, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, she admitted that she had suspected something of the sort at the time, though she had never dared speak of it, not with the old Duke's temper being what it was. "I heard whispers, Your Grace," she said quietly, wringing her hands. "A stable boy mentioned once that Eleanor had been unwell before she left, in a way that suggested more than simple illness. But your father made it very clear that Eleanor's name was not to be spoken within these walls again, and I was young and frightened of losing my position. I said nothing, and eventually the whispers faded, and I told myself perhaps I had misunderstood entirely." Edmund closed his eyes, absorbing this confirmation of what he already suspected to be true. "And the Whitfield family? Do you know anything of them?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Only that they were a quiet family, kept mostly to themselves in Hollow Brook. I did not know them well." Edmund thanked her and dismissed her again, though this time his mind was already turning toward what he must do next. He needed proof beyond old records and faded memories, something undeniable that would confirm what he already believed in his heart to be true. He thought of the birthmark again, so precisely matching the one Eleanor had carried, and knew he needed to speak with Clara directly, though he hardly knew how to begin such a conversation after everything that had passed between them since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. He found her in the nursery that afternoon, kneeling on the floor helping a small boy build a tower of wooden blocks, her expression soft and patient in a way that struck Edmund deeply now that he understood what he was truly looking at. Not a suspect. Not a stranger accused of terrible things. His daughter, kneeling on a nursery floor, utterly unaware of the truth that had upended his entire understanding of the world over the past 2 days. "Clara," he said, his voice gentler than she had heard from him since her arrival. "Might I speak with you privately?" She rose slowly, uncertainty flickering across her face at this sudden change in his manner. "Of course, Your Grace." He led her to his study, the same room she had glimpsed briefly days before, and closed the door behind them. Clara stood near the entrance, unsure what to expect, watching as the Duke moved to his desk and picked up the faded portrait she had noticed him holding before, though she still could not see it clearly from where she stood. "I owe you an apology," Edmund began, his voice carrying none of the anger that had defined their earlier meetings. "I have wronged you gravely since the moment I entered your home and accused you of unspeakable things. I believed, wrongly, that you had some hand in my son's death, and I let my grief blind me to reason and fairness alike." Clara said nothing, too stunned by this sudden shift to find words of her own. "I have since learned something," he continued, "something I can hardly believe myself, though the evidence before me leaves little room for doubt. May I ask you something about your childhood, about the family who raised you?" Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "What would you like to know?" "Were you always told the Whitfields were your birth family, or did they ever suggest otherwise?" Clara's chest tightened at the question, memories of her adoptive mother's careful evasiveness rushing back to her all at once. "They told me my birth parents could not care for me, and that I was given to them as an infant. They never spoke much of the circumstances, and I learned early not to press the matter, as it seemed to cause my mother distress whenever I asked." Edmund's hands trembled slightly as he held the faded portrait toward her, turning it so she could finally see the image clearly. A young woman with soft brown hair and gentle eyes looked back at Clara from the aged canvas, a woman Clara had never seen before in her life. Yet something about the face felt strangely, impossibly familiar, as though she were looking into a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had never known. "This is Eleanor Marsh," Edmund said quietly. "She worked in the gardens here at Ashcombe Hall many years ago. We loved each other, before my father discovered our attachment and forced us apart, arranging my marriage to another woman within months. I never knew what became of her afterward. I believed I had simply lost her. Clara stared at the portrait, unable to look away from the woman's face, searching for some sense of recognition she could not quite grasp. Why are you telling me this? Edmund set the portrait down carefully and reached for the old parish record he had found the night before, sliding it across the desk toward her. Because I believe, Clara, that Eleanor was your mother, and if that is true, then I am your father. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and enormous, and Clara felt the room tilt slightly around her as she reached for the desk to steady herself. She stared at the faded document, at names and dates that meant little to her at first glance, and then at the birthmark peeking from beneath her own sleeve as she gripped the edge of the desk, the same crescent shape she had carried her whole life without ever understanding its significance. That cannot be true, she whispered, though even as she said it, pieces of her own scattered memories began arranging themselves into a shape that made a terrible, beautiful kind of sense. The distant, careful silence of her adoptive mother. The small silver ring in her wooden box, far too fine for a simple village family to have given her by chance. The strange sense of recognition that had troubled her since first arriving at Ashcombe Hall, as though some forgotten part of herself recognized these halls despite having no clear memory of ever walking them as a small child. I understand this is a great deal to accept all at once, Edmund said, his voice gentle despite the emotion clearly straining beneath it. I do not ask you to believe it simply because I wish it to be true. I only ask that you consider the possibility, and allow me to seek further proof, so that we might both understand the truth of where you came from, and who you truly are. Clara looked up at him. This man who had stormed into her home days before threatening her with prison and death, now standing before her with tears gathering in his eyes, looking at her with a desperate hope she had never seen from anyone in her life before. Whatever anger she had carried toward him for his earlier cruelty seemed to shrink beside the enormity of what he was suggesting, though a small, cautious part of her remained wary, unwilling to accept such an enormous claim without further evidence to support it. I need time, she said finally. This is too much to simply accept on the strength of an old portrait and a faded record. Of course, Edmund said quickly. Take whatever time you need. I will not press you further today. But please know, Clara, whatever the truth ultimately proves to be, I am deeply sorry for how I treated you when you first arrived. No father should speak to his own daughter the way I spoke to you, and no amount of apology can fully undo that wrong. Clara left his study soon after, her mind spinning with everything she had just learned, the wooden box waiting for her in her locked room suddenly feeling far heavier with meaning than it ever had before. As she walked the long corridor back to her chamber, she passed a window overlooking the gardens below, and for just a moment, she thought she saw a woman with soft brown hair standing among the roses, humming a tune achingly familiar from a dream she could not fully remember, before the figure vanished entirely, leaving only sunlight and empty garden paths behind. That night, alone in her room, Clara opened the wooden box once more and laid its contents carefully across her bed, the embroidered handkerchief, the small silver ring, the folded paper with its faded ink. She held the paper close to the candle flame, tilting it this way and that, straining to make out words she had never been able to read clearly before. This time, perhaps because she now knew what to look for, she thought she could make out a single line near the bottom, written in careful, looping handwriting. For my daughter, so she may know she was loved, even when I could not keep her. Tears filled her eyes as she read the words again and again, the paper trembling in her hands. If this was truly Eleanor's writing, then the woman had not abandoned her out of indifference or cruelty, but out of some terrible necessity, forced by circumstances beyond her control to give up the child she clearly loved. Clara thought of the Whitfields, of the quiet, careful kindness they had shown her throughout her childhood, despite never being able to speak openly about where she had come from, and wondered now whether they too had been sworn to some manner of secrecy, protecting a truth that was never truly theirs to reveal. She thought of Edmund's face as he had shown her the portrait, the raw grief and hope mingled together in his expression, so different from the cold fury he had carried into her cottage days before. Whatever else remained uncertain, she could not deny that his pain seemed genuine, that a man capable of such careful, desperate hope over the possibility of a daughter he never knew he had, was not the same man who had first accused her of murder in a fit of blind grief. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally arrived, Clara dreamed again of the garden, clearer this time than before. She saw the woman from the portrait kneeling among the roses, humming softly, and felt herself as a small child sitting nearby, watching her mother's hands move gently among the flowers. The dream felt less like imagination and more like memory, fragments of a life she had lived so briefly that her conscious mind had never managed to hold on to it, buried instead somewhere deeper, waiting all these years to be uncovered. She woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in her mind, and found herself unable to return to sleep. Instead, she sat by her window watching the sky slowly lighten over the hills surrounding Ashcombe Hall, turning the small silver ring over in her fingers as she considered everything that had happened since her arrival. A week ago, she had been a simple widow living quietly in Hollowbrook, her days filled with small, familiar routines. Now she sat in a locked room within a duke's grand house, contemplating the possibility that she was not merely a suspect in his son's death, but his own long-lost daughter, sister to the very heir whose death had brought her here in chains of suspicion in the first place. The following morning, Margaret arrived at Clara's door earlier than usual, carrying a tray of breakfast and an expression far gentler than any she had shown before. She set the tray down carefully and, after a moment's hesitation, spoke in a low voice. "I remember your mother," she said quietly. "Eleanor. She used to sing while she worked in the gardens, the same tune she taught the other maids, though none of us ever learned the words properly. She had kind eyes, and she loved the roses more than any other flower on the estate." Margaret paused, studying Clara's face carefully. "You have her eyes, you know. I noticed it the very first day you arrived, though I did not dare speak of it until now." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion at these words, this small confirmation from someone who had known Eleanor personally, however briefly. "Did you know her well?" "Not well, but well enough to remember her kindness. She was young and gentle and did not deserve what happened to her, being sent away so suddenly, with no warning to any of us who considered her a friend." Margaret's eyes grew distant, remembering. "The old Duke was a hard man, your Grace's father. He would not tolerate any attachment he considered beneath the family's standing, and Eleanor, for all her kindness, was only a gardener's daughter herself, with no fortune or title to recommend her. What happened to her after she left? Do you know?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No one ever learned for certain. Some said she went to relatives in the north. Others believed she never survived the birth of her child, though that was only rumor, nothing confirmed." She reached out and squeezed Clara's hand gently, an unexpected gesture of warmth from a woman who had seemed so guarded and formal since Clara's arrival. "Whatever the truth proves to be, I am glad to see something of her kindness still living in this house, even after all these years of sorrow." After Margaret left, Clara sat with her breakfast growing cold beside her, turning over this new information carefully. If Eleanor had not survived childbirth, then Clara truly might never learn more about her mother beyond old records and second-hand memories from those who had known her only briefly. But if she had survived, perhaps somewhere, even now, there remained some trace of her, some answer to the questions that had haunted Clara's entire life, without her ever fully understanding why. She resolved that morning to seek out more information herself, rather than simply waiting for Edmund to uncover answers on her behalf. She began, cautiously, to ask questions of the other servants she encountered throughout her days in the nursery, careful not to reveal too much of what she had learned, unwilling to stir gossip before she understood the full truth herself. Most had no memory of Eleanor at all, too young to have worked at Ashcombe Hall during that distant time, but a few older staff members offered small fragments, confirming pieces of what Margaret had already told her, painting a picture of a kind, gentle young woman whose sudden disappearance had left a quiet sorrow lingering in the household for years afterward. By the end of the day, exhausted from carrying the weight of so much uncertainty, Clara returned to her room and found, to her surprise, that the door was no longer locked. A small note sat on her table, written in Edmund's careful hand, informing her that she was free to move about the house and grounds as she wished, that whatever suspicion had once justified her confinement no longer held any weight in his mind. She stood staring at the note for a long moment, feeling the strange, disorienting shift from prisoner to something else entirely, something she did not yet have the words to name. She stepped out into the corridor slowly, testing this new freedom with cautious steps, and made her way toward the gardens she had glimpsed from her window the night before, drawn by some instinct she could not fully explain, hoping perhaps to find some further trace of the mother she had never known, waiting quietly among the roses for her to finally arrive. The rose garden stretched wider than Clara had imagined from her window above, paths of white gravel winding between beds bursting with color, the air thick with sweetness that seemed to press against her chest as she walked among them. She moved slowly, uncertain what she hoped to find, letting her fingers trail across the petals as she passed, searching for some feeling of recognition that never quite arrived, though the beauty of the place stirred something quiet and unnamed within her all the same. She did not notice the man watching her from beneath the shade of a large oak tree at the garden's edge, until she had nearly reached the far wall. He stepped forward as she turned, his expression carefully polite, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "You must be the woman causing such a stir throughout the household," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, though it carried an edge Clara could not quite place. "I am Gerald Ashcombe, cousin to the Duke, and you, I understand, are being considered for a rather remarkable claim." Clara studied him carefully, noting the fine cut of his clothing, the easy confidence in his posture. "Clara Whitfield," she said simply, offering no further explanation. "Whitfield," Gerald repeated the name with something like amusement. "A fitting name for a woman raised in obscurity, though I understand the Duke now believes you carry rather grander blood than your upbringing suggested." He stepped closer, his tone still pleasant despite the sharpness beneath it. "Forgive my directness, but you must understand my position. Should Edmund have no legitimate heir, the title and estate would pass to me. A sudden daughter, appearing so conveniently after his son's tragic death, raises certain questions in my mind that I suspect a more careful man would also consider." "I did not ask to be brought here," Clara said evenly, refusing to let his implication rattle her composure. "Nor did I ask for any claim to be made on my behalf. If the Duke wishes to pursue the truth of my parentage, that is his decision, not mine." "Of course," Gerald smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Still, I find it a remarkable coincidence. Do you not agree? A woman accused of involvement in Julian's death suddenly transformed into a beloved lost daughter, all within the span of a single week. Some might call it fortune, others might call it something rather more calculated." Clara felt anger rising in her chest, though she kept her voice steady. "I have made no calculations, Lord Ashcombe. I have only answered honestly whatever questions have been put to me. If you doubt the truth of my birth, I suggest you take the matter up with the Duke and his records rather than accusing me of scheming for a position I never sought." Gerald studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his calm expression, and Clara understood, with sudden clarity, that she had made an enemy in this brief exchange, whether she wished to or not. "A bold answer," he said finally, "for a woman whose future remains so uncertain. I wish you well, Miss Whitfield, whatever the truth ultimately proves to be, though I confess I intend to watch this matter unfold rather closely." He inclined his head slightly and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone among the roses, her earlier peace thoroughly disturbed by his veiled threats. She understood now, more clearly than before, that her sudden appearance in Edmund's life carried consequences far beyond her own personal confusion and grief. If she truly was his daughter, her existence threatened Gerald's inheritance, and men had done terrible things for far smaller stakes than an entire dukedom. She returned to the house troubled, finding Edmund in his study once again, poring over more old documents he had gathered in his ongoing effort to confirm the truth of her birth. She told him of her encounter with Gerald, watching his expression darken as she spoke. "He has always resented standing so close to inheritance without ever holding it himself," Edmund said grimly. "I did not expect him to learn of this so quickly, though I suppose I should have anticipated it. Gossip moves swiftly through a house this size. He seemed to suggest I might be lying, or scheming somehow, to claim a place I do not deserve," Clara said. "I do not know how to answer such accusations, Your Grace, when I did not seek any of this myself." "You need not answer them at all," Edmund said firmly. "The truth will speak for itself once we have sufficient proof, and Gerald's suspicions, however loudly voiced, will mean nothing against solid evidence." He gestured toward the desk, where several new documents lay spread beside the parish record he had shown her days before. "I have written to the solicitor mentioned in Eleanor's birth registry, hoping he may still be found, or that his record survives somewhere that might confirm the arrangement made with your adoptive family." Clara nodded, though uncertainty still weighed heavily on her. "And if no further proof can be found, what then?" Edmund's expression softened, and for a moment, the careful formality that had governed most of their interactions since the truth first emerged fell away entirely. "Then I will still know in my heart what I believe to be true, Clara. The birthmark alone convinces me beyond reasonable doubt, though I understand the law and the world beyond these walls will require more than a father's certainty to accept you fully as my daughter." Something in his sincerity moved her despite her lingering caution, and she found herself, for the first time since her arrival, beginning to consider him not merely as the Duke who had once threatened her with prison, but as a man genuinely grieving the years he had lost with a daughter he never knew existed. The transformation felt strange and fragile, built on such recent and uncertain ground, yet undeniably present all the same. Over the following days, Clara found herself spending more time with Edmund, walking the gardens together in the evenings, sharing small stories of her childhood with the Whitfields, while he told her of Julian, of the son he had lost, of the grief that had driven him to such cruelty when he first believed her responsible for his death. She learned that Julian had been kind and thoughtful, quick to laugh, beloved by everyone who knew him, and she found herself grieving a brother she had never known, mourning the relationship they might have shared had circumstances been different. "He would have liked you," Edmund said one evening, as they walked beneath the fading light of sunset. "He always had a gentle heart, quick to welcome anyone treated unfairly by others. I think he would have been glad to learn he had a sister." Clara felt tears gathering at these words, grief for a brother she had lost before ever knowing him mixing with the strange, tentative hope growing within her, regarding the father walking beside her now. "I wish I could have known him," she said softly, "even for a short time." "As do I," Edmund replied, his voice heavy with old sorrow. "I have lost so much time with both my children, through my father's cruelty and my own failure to seek the truth sooner. I do not intend to lose whatever time remains with you as well, Clara, whatever proof ultimately confirms what I already believe in my heart." Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed within the household. Alice, who had grown steadily more comfortable around Clara since her earlier nervousness, mentioned quietly one afternoon that talk had spread quickly among the staff, some hopeful for Clara's sake, others wary of the change such news might bring to the estate's future. Gerald's visits to Ashcombe Hall grew more frequent as the days passed, his presence always accompanied by careful, probing questions directed at various members of the household, seeking any detail that might undermine the growing certainty surrounding Clara's parentage. Clara tried to ignore his interference as best she could, focusing instead on the tentative bond forming between herself and the father she had never known she possessed. Yet a quiet unease lingered beneath her growing hope, an awareness that Gerald would not simply accept whatever truth eventually emerged, not when so much stood to be lost should Clara's claim be confirmed beyond doubt. She thought often of his parting words in the garden, his promise to watch this matter unfold closely, and wondered, with growing apprehension, what lengths a man might go to protect an inheritance he had spent his entire life expecting to claim. A week after her conversation with Gerald in the garden, a letter arrived from the solicitor Edmund had written to, an elderly man named Bennett who had handled a great many private arrangements for families in the county decades before. Edmund read the letter twice before summoning Clara to his study, his expression a careful mixture of hope and hesitation as he handed the pages to her. Bennett confirmed that he had indeed arranged, many years ago, for an infant girl to be placed with a family named Whitfield, in the village of Hollow Brook, at the request of a young woman, who had given her name only as Eleanor, unwilling at the time to reveal her full circumstances out of fear for her own safety and that of her child. The solicitor recalled that Eleanor had wept bitterly during their final meeting, insisting that the arrangement was made out of necessity rather than any lack of love, and had left behind a small collection of keepsakes to be given to the child when she came of age, including a ring and a handkerchief marked with initials that matched no family Bennett had ever represented before or since. Clara read the letter twice herself, her hands trembling as she reached the final lines, where Bennett noted that Eleanor had passed away not long after arranging the adoption, succumbing to a fever that swept through the village where she had taken refuge, too weak from childbirth to recover fully. The solicitor expressed his sorrow at delivering such news after so many years, but confirmed that he had personally overseen Eleanor's modest burial, and could, if requested, provide the location of her grave. Grief swept through Clara unlike anything she had expected, mourning a mother she had never known yet had somehow carried within her all her life, present in the shape of her own wrist, in dreams she could not fully explain, in a longing she had never understood the source of until now. She looked up at Edmund and found him equally overcome, tears sliding freely down his face, as he absorbed the confirmation of what he had feared and hoped in equal measure since first glimpsing her birthmark in the nursery weeks before. "She never stopped loving either of us," Edmund said quietly, his voice breaking on the words. "Even at the end, weakened and alone, she thought only of ensuring you would know you were wanted, that you were loved, even though circumstances forced her to give you up." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and allowed Edmund to draw her into an embrace, the first physical comfort they had shared since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. Whatever uncertainty had lingered before this moment dissolved entirely in the face of such undeniable proof, grief for a shared loss binding father and daughter together more firmly than any document or birthmark alone could have achieved. In the days that followed, Edmund arranged for a small memorial to be placed in the family chapel, honoring Eleanor's memory despite the years of silence that had denied her any proper acknowledgement within these walls. Clara visited the chapel often, sitting quietly before the simple stone marker bearing her mother's name, finding a strange peace in finally having somewhere tangible to direct the grief and longing she had carried unknowingly her entire life. Yet even as father and daughter grew closer, bound together by shared sorrow and cautious hope, Gerald's presence at the estate remained a persistent shadow over their fragile happiness. He arrived one afternoon while Clara sat with Edmund reviewing the solicitor's letter once more, entering the study without invitation, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes moved quickly over the documents spread across the desk. "I understand congratulations may be in order," he said smoothly, though his tone carried no genuine warmth. "A confirmed daughter, complete with a solicitor's testimony and a mother's grave to visit. How thoroughly convenient." "The proof is genuine, Gerald," Edmund said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger at his cousin's continued skepticism. "I would advise you to accept it gracefully rather than continue suggesting deception where none exists." "I accept whatever evidence you present, cousin, as I must," Gerald replied, though something calculating remained behind his careful words. "I only hope, for the sake of this family's reputation, that no further surprises await us as this matter continues to unfold. Such sudden revelations, however genuine, tend to invite scrutiny from those less inclined towards sentiment than yourself." He left soon after, but his visit lingered in the air long after his departure, a reminder that whatever peace Clara had begun to find within these walls remained fragile, threatened by a man whose ambitions had not diminished simply because the truth had been confirmed. Clara noticed Edmund's jaw remained tight for the rest of the afternoon, his earlier joy dampened by the renewed awareness of his cousin's hostility, and she wondered, not for the first time, what steps Gerald might take should gentler forms of doubt fail to shake the truth that now stood so firmly between him and the inheritance he had long considered his rightful due. The knock came late at night, sharp and urgent against Clara's door, pulling her from a restless sleep filled with fragments of her mother's face. She rose quickly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door to find Alice standing there, her candle flickering with the trembling of her hand. "Miss Whitfield, you must come quickly," Alice whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. "I overheard something I believe you and the Duke need to know at once." Clara followed her down the darkened hallway toward Edmund's private chambers, her heart pounding with each hurried step. Alice explained in hushed, breathless tones that she had been passing near the servants' stairwell when she overheard Gerald speaking quietly with a man she did not recognize, their voices low but carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of a plan that chilled her deeply. Something about removing Clara from the estate before any formal announcement could be made regarding her parentage. Something about ensuring she never reached whatever proof Edmund intended to present publicly. They woke Edmund together, and Clara watched his face harden with fury as Alice repeated what she had overheard, his earlier restraint toward his cousin's hostility, finally giving way to something far more dangerous. "He would truly go so far," Edmund said, his voice low and controlled despite the anger clearly simmering beneath it. "I had hoped, even after everything, that some remnant of family loyalty might restrain him. It seems I was wrong to hope for such decency." "What will you do?" Clara asked, fear coiling tightly in her chest at the thought of what Gerald might attempt. "First, I will ensure your safety." Edmund rose immediately, already moving toward his wardrobe to dress despite the late hour. "You will not remain in your current chamber tonight. I will have you moved to rooms nearer my own, where I can better guarantee your protection until we understand the full extent of what Gerald intends." Alice hurried away to arrange the change of chambers, while Edmund summoned 2 trusted guards, men who had served the estate loyally for many years, and whose discretion he trusted completely. Clara found herself moved within the hour to a new room adjoining Edmund's own quarters, guards stationed outside her door, though sleep remained impossible for the remainder of that long, anxious night. The next morning, Edmund called for Gerald directly, choosing to confront the matter openly rather than allow suspicion and secrecy to fester any further within the household. Gerald arrived at the appointed hour with his usual composed confidence, though Clara, watching from a corner of the study where Edmund had insisted she remain present, noticed a flicker of unease cross his features when he saw her standing there beside his cousin. "I understand you have been discussing certain plans regarding Miss Whitfield's future," Edmund said, his voice deceptively calm as he faced his cousin across the study. "Plans that do not appear to have originated from any concern for her welfare." Gerald's expression remained carefully composed, though his eyes moved briefly toward Clara before returning to Edmund. "I do not know what you have been told, cousin, but I assure you, whatever rumors have reached your ears have been grossly exaggerated by servants eager to please you with dramatic tales." A witness overheard you speaking of removing her from this estate before any public confirmation of her parentage could be made, Edmund said, his voice hardening. Do you deny this entirely? I deny nothing beyond expressing concern for this family's reputation, Gerald replied, his composure beginning to strain despite his continued denial. Surely you understand my position, Edmund. A lifetime spent as your heir presumptive, only to have that expectation suddenly overturned by a woman appearing from nowhere with a birthmark and a solicitor's convenient testimony. Forgive me if I sought to protect what I have long considered my rightful future. By threatening harm to an innocent woman? Edmund's voice rose now, anger finally breaking through his earlier restraint. My daughter Gerald, whatever your grievances regarding inheritance, you had no right to threaten her safety. Gerald's mask finally cracked entirely, revealing the desperation beneath his careful composure. I have given this family 30 years of loyal service, always waiting patiently for a position I believed would eventually be mine. And now, in the span of a single month, I am to lose everything to a woman who spent her entire life as a common villager, raised by strangers, with no true understanding of what it means to manage an estate of this size and responsibility. That is not your decision to make, Edmund said firmly. Clara is my daughter by blood, confirmed through evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Whatever disappointment you feel regarding your own expectations does not grant you the right to threaten her, nor to interfere with matters that concern only my family and my household. Gerald's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara feared he might attempt some further denial or manipulation. Instead, he turned his sharp gaze directly toward her, his expression cold despite the earlier pleasantness he had shown during their first encounter in the garden. You have won a remarkable prize, Miss Whitfield, whether through genuine birthright or clever fortune, I cannot yet say with certainty. But do not mistake this moment for the end of the matter. I do not surrender what I have long considered mine so easily. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Gerald, Edmund said sharply, stepping between his cousin and Clara with unmistakable protectiveness. Take it however you wish, Gerald replied, his composure returning as quickly as it had cracked. I only state facts, cousin. Contested inheritances have led to far messier outcomes than harsh words exchanged in a private study. He left without further ceremony, his footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor, leaving behind a tension that lingered heavily in the room long after his departure. Edmund turned to Clara immediately, his earlier anger giving way to concern as he studied her pale, shaken expression. I will not allow him to harm you, he said firmly, taking her hands in his own. Whatever measures are necessary, I will ensure your safety, Clara. I have already lost one child to circumstances beyond my control. I will not lose another, not now, not after finally finding you. Clara nodded, though fear still coiled tightly within her chest at the memory of Gerald's cold, calculated threat. What do we do now? We move quickly, Edmund said, already turning toward his desk to gather documents and begin drafting letters. I intend to hold a formal gathering within the week, announcing your parentage publicly before witnesses of standing throughout the county, ensuring the truth becomes undeniable and impossible for Gerald or anyone else to challenge further. Once the matter is settled publicly, whatever schemes he continues to harbor will hold far less power to harm you. Over the following days, preparations for the gathering consumed the household, invitations sent to prominent families throughout the region, careful arrangements made to ensure the solicitor Bennett himself would attend to offer testimony regarding Eleanor's original arrangement for Clara's adoption. Clara found herself swept into a flurry of activity entirely unfamiliar to her previous quiet life, fitted for gowns appropriate to her new position, coached gently by Margaret on the customs and expectations of the society she would soon be formally introduced into as the Duke's acknowledged daughter. Yet beneath all this activity, Clara remained acutely aware of the danger Gerald continued to represent. Edmund had assigned guards to accompany her whenever she moved beyond the immediate safety of her chambers, and though she understood the necessity of such precautions, the constant vigilance wore heavily on her nerves as the days passed toward the planned announcement. 3 days before the gathering was scheduled to take place, Clara received an unexpected note, delivered quietly by a young stable boy who claimed a stranger had paid him to deliver it directly into her hands without anyone else noticing. The note, unsigned, warned her that her safety could not be guaranteed should she proceed with the public announcement, suggesting she quietly leave Ashcombe Hall before matters progressed any further, for her own protection. Clara brought the note immediately to Edmund, her hands trembling as she handed it to him. He read it twice, his expression darkening with barely controlled fury. This is Gerald's doing, without question, though he has been careful enough not to sign his own name to such an obvious threat. Should we delay the announcement? Clara asked, fear evident in her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. No, Edmund said firmly, setting the note aside with deliberate control. Delaying only grants him further opportunity to scheme against you. We proceed as planned, but I will increase your protection significantly between now and the gathering itself. I will not allow fear to dictate our actions, Clara. Not when the truth stands so firmly on our side. Despite his reassurance, the following days passed in a haze of anxious tension for Clara. Every unfamiliar sound within the house causing her heart to race. Every shadow in the corridor making her wary of what might lurk within it. She confided her fears to Margaret one evening, finding unexpected comfort in the older woman's steady, practical presence. Your mother faced her own share of fear in this house, many years ago, Margaret said gently, as she helped Clara prepare for bed. Yet she carried herself always with quiet dignity, refusing to let circumstances beyond her control diminish her spirit entirely. I see much of that same strength in you, Miss Whitfield, whether you recognize it in yourself or not. Clara found herself drawing strength from these words in the days that followed, reminding herself repeatedly that she had already survived far worse than veiled threats and anxious waiting. She had survived accusations of murder, the shock of discovering her true parentage, and grief for a mother she had never known existed until circumstances forced the truth into the open. She would survive this as well, whatever Gerald ultimately attempted, standing firm beside the father who had finally claimed her as his own after so many years of unknowing separation. The night before the scheduled gathering, Clara could not sleep, her mind turning over every possible danger that tomorrow might bring. She rose quietly and made her way to the small chapel where her mother's memorial stood, finding unexpected comfort in the quiet stillness of the space, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through the narrow windows above the stone marker bearing Eleanor's name. She knelt before the memorial, speaking softly to a mother she had never truly known, drawing strength from the connection despite its strange, unfamiliar nature. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, she whispered into the silence, but I will not let fear drive me from the truth of who I am, or the Father who has finally found me. Whatever happens, I intend to see this through, for your sake as much as my own. She remained there for some time, finding a fragile peace settling over her despite the uncertainty that awaited her with the coming dawn, before finally rising and making her way back toward her chambers, ready, as much as she could be, for whatever the following day might demand of her. On her way back through the darkened corridor, Clara paused near a window overlooking the eastern grounds, drawn by a faint flicker of movement near the old carriage house at the edge of the property. She watched carefully, her breath catching as she made out two figures speaking quietly in the shadows, one of them unmistakably Gerald, his tall frame recognizable even in the dim moonlight. The other figure she did not recognize, a stranger wrapped in a dark traveling coat who kept glancing nervously toward the main house, as though wary of being observed. She could not hear their words from such a distance, but something about the hurried, secretive nature of their meeting sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She hurried back to Edmund's chambers immediately, waking him for the second time that week with news of what she had witnessed. He rose at once, moving to the window in his own room that offered a similar view of the carriage house, though by the time he reached it, the two figures had already vanished into the darkness. I will have the guards search the grounds immediately, he said, already reaching for his coat. Whatever Gerald is planning, I do not intend to let it unfold without challenge. The guards found nothing conclusive that night, only fresh tracks near the carriage house suggesting a horse had recently been tied and then ridden away in haste. Edmund doubled the guard posted near Clara's chambers regardless, unwilling to take any further chances with her safety as the gathering drew closer. Clara returned to bed that night with little hope of actual sleep, her mind churning with worry over what Gerald and his mysterious companion might be planning. The following morning brought a flurry of final preparations for the gathering, though an undercurrent of tension ran through the household that no amount of careful arrangement could fully disguise. Margaret oversaw the final fitting of Clara's gown, a deep blue silk that Clara found almost unbearably fine compared to anything she had worn in her previous life, while household staff bustled about preparing the great hall for the evening's formal announcement. Bennett, the elderly solicitor, arrived in the early afternoon, greeting Clara with gentle warmth despite having only exchanged correspondence with her before this moment. He carried with him additional documents he had located since his initial letter, further corroborating details of Eleanor's original arrangement, and expressed his sincere hope that the evening's proceedings would finally grant Clara the recognition and security she deserved after so many years of uncertainty regarding her true origins. Your mother would be proud to see you now, Bennett told her quietly, as they waited together in a small antechamber before the gathering was set to begin. She worried greatly, during our final meeting, that you might grow up never knowing you were loved, never understanding the sacrifice she made to ensure your safety even at the cost of her own happiness. I believe, whatever difficulties tonight may bring, she would find comfort in seeing how far you have come despite everything." Clara thanked him warmly, drawing strength from his kind words as the hour of the gathering approached. She could hear the growing murmur of arriving guests from beyond the antechamber walls, prominent families from throughout the county gathering to witness whatever revelation the Duke intended to share that evening, though few among them yet understood the full nature of what awaited them. Edmund arrived to collect her personally as the appointed hour drew near, his expression a careful mixture of nervousness and determined resolve. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, offering his arm as though she were already fully established as his daughter, rather than someone whose place within this world remained, for a few more hours at least, still formally unconfirmed. "As ready as I believe I can be," Clara answered honestly, taking his offered arm despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Whatever happens tonight, I am grateful you found me, whatever grief and difficulty brought us to this moment." "As am I," Edmund said softly, and together they moved toward the great hall, where the truth of Clara's birth would finally be spoken aloud, before witnesses who could not easily dismiss it, whatever schemes Gerald continued to harbor in the shadows beyond the gathered crowd. At the doorway, Edmund paused a moment longer, turning to look at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something close to pure fatherly pride despite the brief time they had known each other as family. "Whatever Gerald attempts tonight," he said quietly, "know that you do not face it alone. I failed you for 20 years without knowing it. I do not intend to fail you now that the truth stands between us." Clara squeezed his arm gently, grateful beyond words for the steadiness of his presence beside her. Somewhere beyond the great doors, candlelight flickered against the assembled guests, and the low hum of conversation carried a note of anticipation that told her word of tonight's purpose had already begun to spread among those gathered. She took a steadying breath, and together, father and daughter stepped forward into the light. The great hall fell into a hush as Edmund and Clara entered, dozens of curious eyes turning toward them as they crossed the polished floor toward the raised platform where Bennett already stood waiting, his documents arranged carefully on a small table beside him. Clara felt every gaze upon her, the weight of the county's finest families watching closely, some faces showing open curiosity, others carrying the guarded skepticism of those who had already heard whispers of the evening's remarkable purpose. Edmund raised his hand for silence once they reached the platform, and the murmuring crowd quieted immediately, accustomed to obeying the authority of their duke without question. Clara searched the crowd briefly and found Gerald standing near the back of the hall, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes carried a sharp, watchful intensity that sent a fresh chill through her despite the warmth of the crowded room. "I have gathered you all here tonight," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "to share news of great personal significance. News that I believe deserves to be spoken openly, before witnesses of standing, so that no doubt or rumor might diminish the truth I am about to share." He gestured toward Clara, drawing her forward beside him. "This is Clara Whitfield, though I believe, after careful investigation and undeniable evidence, that her rightful name is Clara Ashcombe, my daughter, born to a woman I loved deeply many years ago before circumstances beyond either of our control forced us apart." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the crowd, though Edmund continued before the noise could grow too disruptive. "I understand this news may come as a shock to many of you, and I do not ask for blind acceptance. I ask only that you hear the evidence I have gathered, presented here tonight by Bennett, the solicitor who personally arranged Clara's placement with the Whitfield family shortly after her birth." Bennett stepped forward at this cue, addressing the crowd with the measured, careful authority of a man long accustomed to presenting evidence before skeptical audiences. He described the circumstances of Eleanor's original arrangement, the birth registry confirming the date and location of Clara's birth, and the small keepsakes Eleanor had left behind, including a ring and handkerchief that Clara herself now produced from a small pouch, holding them aloft for the assembled crowd to see clearly. As Bennett continued his testimony, detailing the careful records he had maintained over the decades confirming every aspect of the arrangement, Clara noticed Gerald shifting uncomfortably near the back of the hall, his earlier composed confidence beginning to crack visibly, as the weight of undeniable evidence mounted steadily against whatever doubts he had hoped to sow among the gathered guests. When Bennett finished his testimony, Edmund addressed the crowd once more. "I understand my cousin Gerald has expressed certain doubts regarding this matter. Doubts I believe stem more from concern over his own expectations of inheritance than from genuine skepticism regarding the evidence presented tonight. Edmund's gaze moved deliberately toward Gerald as he spoke, and the crowd's attention followed, turning collectively to study Gerald's increasingly strained expression. I would welcome him to voice any remaining objections openly now, before these witnesses, rather than continue whatever quieter schemes he has pursued these past weeks to undermine my daughter's rightful claim. The hall fell into an uncomfortable silence, every eye now fixed on Gerald as he stood exposed before the very society whose good opinion he had spent his entire life carefully cultivating. Clara watched him carefully, understanding that this moment represented a crucial turning point, one that would either force his schemes fully into the open or compel him to abandon them entirely, rather than risk further public humiliation. "I have no formal objection to raise," Gerald said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, beyond noting that such matters typically deserve more careful, private investigation before being announced so publicly before an entire gathering of witnesses. "The investigation has been thorough, Gerald," Edmund replied evenly. "I do not believe further delay serves any purpose beyond providing additional opportunity for those who might wish harm upon my daughter to act against her." The pointed accusation hung heavily in the air, and several guests exchanged uncertain glances, clearly beginning to sense that far more lay beneath the surface of this gathering than a simple announcement of newfound family. Gerald's face flushed with anger, and something close to panic, as he realized the direction Edmund's words were steering the assembled crowd's understanding of the situation. "I do not know what you mean to suggest," Gerald said, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious effort to maintain composure before such an audience. "I mean to suggest," Edmund said, stepping forward with deliberate authority, "that a threatening note was delivered to my daughter only days ago, warning her to abandon this claim entirely for her own safety. I mean to suggest that you were witnessed meeting secretly with an unknown stranger near the estate's carriage house just 2 nights past. And I mean to suggest, Gerald, that these are not the actions of a man with nothing to hide." Gasps rippled through the crowd at these direct accusations, and Clara watched as Gerald's careful composure finally shattered entirely under the combined weight of public scrutiny and Edmund's unwavering resolve. He looked around at the gathered faces, clearly recognizing that whatever sympathy or support he might have hoped to find among his peers had evaporated entirely in the face of such damning implications. "You cannot prove any connection between myself and whatever note you claim was delivered," Gerald said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Perhaps not with absolute certainty," Edmund acknowledged, "though I suspect a thorough investigation by the proper authorities would uncover whatever connection exists soon enough. Regardless of what can be formally proven tonight, Gerald, I believe those gathered here have witnessed sufficient evidence to draw their own conclusions regarding your character and your recent conduct toward my daughter." The hall remained tensely silent as Gerald stood exposed before the gathered guests, his reputation crumbling visibly with each passing moment. Finally, unable to bear the weight of such public disgrace any longer, he turned and strode quickly from the hall, his footsteps echoing sharply against the polished floor, as he disappeared through the great doors without another word, leaving behind a stunned silence that took several moments to break. Edmund allowed the murmurs to settle before addressing the crowd once more, his tone shifting from the tension of confrontation back toward the warmth of the evening's original purpose. "I regret that such unpleasantness intruded upon what should be a joyful occasion," he said, "but I felt it necessary that you all understand the full truth of recent events, rather than allow whatever doubts my cousin sought to plant continue circulating unchallenged. Tonight, I ask you all to join me in welcoming my daughter, Clara Ashcombe, into this family, and into the society she was always meant to belong to, had circumstances not conspired so cruelly against her for the first 20 years of her life." The crowd's response, hesitant at first, grew steadily warmer, as prominent guests stepped forward one by one to offer their congratulations and welcome, drawn as much by genuine curiosity regarding Clara's remarkable story as by simple deference to their duke's clear wishes. Clara found herself overwhelmed by the sudden attention, though Edmund remained steadily beside her throughout the evening, offering quiet reassurance whenever the weight of so much scrutiny threatened to become too heavy to bear gracefully. Margaret approached late in the evening, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she embraced Clara warmly, a gesture entirely inappropriate between housekeeper and duke's daughter under normal circumstances, though no one in the hall seemed inclined to remark upon it given everything that had transpired that evening. "Your mother would be so proud," Margaret whispered, echoing Bennett's earlier sentiment. "You have carried yourself with such grace and courage through everything that has happened. She would recognize her own strength living on so clearly within you." As the gathering finally began to wind down in the late hours of the night, Edmund drew Clara aside to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the remaining guests, still lingering over final conversations and refreshments. "I know tonight was difficult," he said gently, facing not only public scrutiny but Gerald's open hostility before so many witnesses. "I am deeply sorry you were forced to endure such a confrontation on what should have been simply a celebration." "I do not regret it," Clara said honestly, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever discomfort tonight brought, I would rather face Gerald's schemes openly than continue living beneath the shadow of his threats indefinitely. Tonight at least, the truth stands clearly for everyone to see, whatever consequences follow from his exposure." Edmund smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes that Clara had rarely seen from him even during their growing closeness over recent weeks. "You possess remarkable strength, Clara. I see so much of your mother in you, though I suspect you carry a determination entirely your own as well, forged through years of hardship I wish desperately you had never been forced to endure." In the weeks that followed, Gerald's schemes unraveled further, as investigation confirmed his involvement in both the threatening note and secretive arrangements to have Clara removed from the estate before the truth could be formally established. Facing certain disgrace and potential legal consequences, he departed the county entirely, seeking whatever fresh start might be found far from the ruins of his former standing and expectations. Edmund formally severed whatever remaining ties existed between Gerald and the estate's future inheritance, ensuring no further threat could arise from that quarter regarding Clara's rightful place within the family. Clara settled gradually into her new life at Ashcombe Hall, the strangeness of her transformed circumstances slowly giving way to genuine comfort as she grew accustomed to her role within the household and the wider society she now belonged to by birth. She maintained her visits to the nursery, unwilling to abandon the children who had shown her such simple, uncomplicated kindness during her earliest, most uncertain days within these walls, and continued visiting her mother's memorial in the family chapel regularly, finding continued peace in that quiet connection to the woman whose sacrifice had ultimately led her, through such a long and difficult road, back to the family she had never known she was missing. Edmund, for his part, dedicated himself fully to making amends for the years he had unknowingly lost with his daughter, determined that whatever time remained to them together would be filled with the warmth and connection that circumstances had so cruelly denied them both for far too long. One quiet afternoon, several weeks after the gathering, Edmund invited Clara to walk with him through the portrait gallery that lined the western corridor of Ashcombe Hall, a room she had passed many times but never lingered in during her earlier days as a suspected criminal within these walls. He stopped before a large blank space on the wall, positioned prominently among the portraits of generations of Ashcombe ancestors. "I have commissioned a painter to come next month," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "I intend for your portrait to hang here, alongside the rest of the family, so that generations after us will know that Clara Ashcombe belonged fully and rightfully among these halls, whatever circumstances once tried to suggest otherwise." Clara felt tears gathering at the thought, overwhelmed by this simple, permanent acknowledgement of her place within a family she had never expected to claim. "I would like that very much," she said softly, reaching out to touch the empty space on the wall where her image would soon join those who had come before her. As the months passed, Clara found herself growing more confident in her new role, learning gradually the responsibilities that would one day fall to her as Edmund's acknowledged heir, given that no closer male relative remained to challenge her position following Gerald's disgrace and departure. She studied estate matters alongside Edmund's steward, learned the names and needs of tenant families across the wider Ashcombe lands, and slowly began to understand the weight of responsibility that came alongside the comfort and security her new position provided. She also maintained her friendship with Alice and Margaret, refusing to let her elevated circumstances create distance between herself and those who had shown her kindness during her most difficult days at the estate. Alice in particular became something close to a genuine companion. The two young women often found together in quiet corners of the house, sharing stories and laughter that helped ease the lingering strangeness of Clara's transformed life. One evening in early autumn, as golden light spilled across the gardens where Clara had first wandered searching for some connection to the mother she never knew, Edmund found her sitting quietly near the rose beds, the same wooden box that had once held her only connections to her true origins resting open beside her on the stone bench. "You often come here," he observed, settling beside her. "I feel closest to her among the roses," Clara admitted. "Margaret told me once that this was Eleanor's favorite place on the entire estate. I like to imagine she still walks here sometimes, watching over everything that has happened since she left." Edmund reached for her hand gently. "I believe she would be proud of everything you have become, Clara, not simply because you are now recognized as my daughter, with all the comfort and standing that brings, but because of the courage and grace you have shown throughout everything that has happened these past months. You faced accusation, confinement, threats against your very safety, and through it all, you never once compromised your honesty or your kindness toward others. That is a rare quality, one I suspect she would have recognized immediately as entirely her own daughter's inheritance, far more valuable than any title or estate. Clara leaned her head gently against his shoulder, a gesture of quiet affection that would have seemed impossible between them only months before, when suspicion and grief had defined every interaction they shared. "Thank you for not giving up on finding the truth," she said softly. "Even after everything, even when I gave you every reason to doubt me at first, you kept searching until you found it." "I could not have done otherwise," Edmund replied. "Once I saw that birthmark and allowed myself to hope, however impossible it seemed at first, that some part of Eleanor might still remain in this world after all these years of believing I had lost her entirely." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its slow descent behind the hills surrounding Ashcombe Hall, father and daughter finally at peace after a journey that had begun with such terrible accusation and fear, transformed gradually through hardship and courage into genuine, hard-won belonging. The estate that had once represented nothing but danger and suspicion to Clara now felt, at last, entirely like home. Every stone and garden path carrying the quiet promise of a future finally free from the shadows that had once threatened to destroy it before it could properly begin. In time, word of Clara's remarkable story spread throughout the county and beyond, told and retold at gatherings and dinner parties, as a tale of justice ultimately triumphing over cruelty and greed, of a father and daughter finally reunited after circumstances beyond their control had once torn apart the family they were always meant to share. Clara herself grew tired, eventually, of hearing her own story repeated back to her by curious strangers eager for details of her remarkable transformation, from accused villager to acknowledged duke's daughter, but she never tired of the quiet, steady presence of the father who had fought so fiercely to claim her, nor of the peaceful sanctuary the rose garden continued to offer whenever she needed to feel close once more to the mother, whose sacrifice had made everything that followed possible. A year passed at Ashcombe Hall, and with it came changes that Clara could scarcely have imagined during those first frightened days, when Edmund had stormed into her small cottage demanding answers she did not possess. The portrait Edmund had promised, now hung in the gallery among generations of Ashcombe ancestors, capturing Clara in a deep green gown, her expression calm and steady, the painter having somehow managed to catch the quiet strength that Margaret so often spoke of when describing Eleanor's own character decades before. Clara had grown fully into her responsibilities as Edmund's heir, spending long hours alongside the estate steward learning the details of tenant agreements, harvest arrangements, and the countless small decisions that kept Ashcombe Hall running smoothly throughout each changing season. She approached these duties with the same patient thoroughness she had once brought to caring for the servants' children in the nursery, and slowly, the household staff who had once regarded her with wary suspicion began speaking of her with genuine respect and warmth. Word arrived one spring morning that Gerald had settled far to the north, in a modest situation that bore little resemblance to the grand future he had once expected as Edmund's heir presumptive. Gerald had already brought upon himself. Edmund read the report from his solicitor with quiet satisfaction. Though he expressed no particular desire for further punishment beyond the loss of standing Gerald had already brought upon himself through his own scheming. Clara felt a complicated mixture of relief and something almost like pity when she heard the news. Grateful that the threat against her safety had finally faded entirely, though she could not entirely forget the desperate fear that had driven a man to such cruel extremes in defense of an inheritance he ultimately proved unworthy of holding. Alice, meanwhile, had grown into something between a lady's companion and a true friend, accompanying Clara on her rounds of the tenant cottages and sharing quiet evenings together discussing everything from estate matters to simple gossip that had nothing whatsoever to do with duty or responsibility. Their friendship remained one of the steadiest comforts in Clara's transformed life, a reminder that whatever grand circumstances now surrounded her, the simple human connections that had sustained her through her most difficult days remained just as valuable as ever. Margaret continued serving as housekeeper, though age had begun to soften her once formal manner considerably, particularly whenever Clara sought her out for stories of Eleanor's brief time at Ashcombe Hall so many years before. Through Margaret's patient recollections, gathered gradually over many quiet afternoons, Clara built a fuller picture of the mother she had never known, a young woman of gentle humor and quiet determination, who had faced her own hardships with a grace that Clara increasingly recognized reflected in her own character, inherited across the years despite never having known her mother directly. Edmund, for his part, had grown visibly lighter in the year since Clara's arrival, the heavy grief that had once defined every interaction between them gradually easing into something closer to genuine contentment. He still visited Julian's memorial regularly, and Clara often joined him there now, honoring the brother she had never known but had come to feel connected to through the stories Edmund shared of his kindness and warmth. Grief for Julian never fully disappeared, but it settled into something more peaceful over time, no longer the raw, consuming force that had once driven Edmund to such cruel accusations against an innocent woman he did not yet know was his own daughter. One autumn afternoon, nearly 18 months after Clara's arrival at Ashcombe Hall, a young man named Henry Caldwell arrived at the estate, sent by a neighboring family to discuss matters of shared tenant boundaries with Edmund's steward. Clara, overseeing the meeting on Edmund's behalf while he attended to matters in the county seat, found herself immediately struck by Henry's easy warmth and genuine interest in the practical details of estate management, qualities she had come to value highly through her own growing responsibilities. Their conversation, meant to address simple boundary matters, extended well beyond its practical purpose, both finding unexpected pleasure in discussing everything from crop rotations to the books they had recently read. Henry returned the following week under the pretense of further boundary discussions, and Clara found herself looking forward to his visits with a warmth she had not expected to feel again after the losses and hardships of her earlier life. Edmund noticed the growing friendship with quiet approval, having made careful inquiries into Henry's character and family standing before allowing the acquaintance to develop further. He found nothing but genuine respect in the reports that reached him. Henry, known throughout the county as a thoughtful, hard-working man who managed his own smaller estate with considerable skill and fairness toward his tenants, qualities Edmund valued far more highly than mere title or fortune. Their courtship developed slowly over the following months, careful and unhurried, built on genuine friendship rather than the desperate urgency that had once defined so much of Clara's difficult first year at Ashcombe Hall. Henry proved himself patient and kind, never pressing Clara for more than she felt ready to offer, understanding intuitively the particular caution that lingered within her, following everything she had endured before finding her rightful place within the Ashcombe family. By the following spring, nearly 2 years after Duke Edmund Ashcombe had first stormed into a small cottage demanding answers about his son's death, Clara stood once more in the rose garden that had become so central to her new life, though this time surrounded by joy rather than uncertainty. Henry knelt before her among the same roses where she had once searched desperately for some connection to the mother she never knew, offering a simple ring, far different from the delicate silver one that had once been her only tangible link to her true origins. Clara accepted without hesitation, tears of genuine happiness gathering as Henry rose to embrace her, the garden around them bursting with the same fragrant blooms that had witnessed so much of her transformation over the past 2 years. Margaret watched from a nearby window with unashamed tears of her own, while Edmund, informed of the happy news soon after, could not contain the broad, genuine smile that spread across his face at seeing his daughter finally claiming the kind of quiet, deserved happiness that circumstances had once so thoroughly denied both of them. Their wedding took place that summer in the very chapel where Eleanor's memorial stood, a choice Clara made deliberately, wanting her mother's memory present in some small way during the most significant celebration of her new life. Edmund walked her down the aisle himself, his pride evident in every measured step, thinking, as he often did during quiet moments, of how differently everything might have unfolded had he never glimpsed that small crescent birthmark on his daughter's wrist during an otherwise ordinary afternoon in the nursery. Life at Ashcombe Hall settled into a gentler rhythm following the wedding, Henry choosing to divide his time between his own smaller estate and Ashcombe Hall, as Clara continued preparing for the responsibilities that would eventually become fully hers as Edmund's heir. Children's laughter began filling the nursery once more within a few years, Clara's own son and daughter growing up surrounded by the same gardens and gentle staff who had once helped their mother through the most difficult transformation of her life. Edmund grew old gracefully in the years that followed, watching his grandchildren grow with the same quiet contentment that had gradually replaced the grief and anger that once defined him. He often told them stories of their grandmother Eleanor, ensuring her memory remained alive within the family despite the many years that had passed since her death. And he never failed to remind Clara, whenever the opportunity arose, how grateful he remained that fate had eventually brought her home to him, however cruel and circuitous the path that led them there had ultimately proven to be. Clara herself, in the quiet moments she allowed herself amid the busy responsibilities of managing both family and estate, often returned to the rose garden alone, sitting on the same stone bench where she had once wept over her mother's fate, now finding only peace and gratitude in that same quiet space. She had come to Ashcombe Hall as an accused stranger, threatened with prison and disgrace, and had left that difficult chapter of her life behind entirely, transformed instead into a woman who belonged fully and rightfully to a family and a home she had never known she was always meant to inherit, carrying forward her mother's quiet strength and her father's hard-won wisdom into whatever future still awaited the generations of Ashcombes yet to come. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the last light of day faded gently behind the hills, Clara would sometimes walk the gallery corridor alone, pausing before her own portrait and the empty space that had once troubled her so deeply during her earliest days at the estate. Beside her painted likeness now hung a smaller portrait of Eleanor, commissioned from the faded original Edmund had kept locked away for so many years, restored and reframed so that mother and daughter finally stood together, if only in paint and memory, within the same walls that had once separated them so completely. She often brought her own children to stand before these portraits, telling them gently the story of their grandmother's quiet courage, of the sacrifice she had made to protect a daughter she could not keep, and of the long, difficult road that had eventually led that daughter home again. Her children listened with the wide-eyed wonder, particular to the young, unable to fully grasp the depth of hardship contained within the tale, though Clara hoped that as they grew older, the story would offer them something valuable beyond simple family history, a reminder that love, however delayed or interrupted by cruelty and circumstance, could still find its way home eventually, given enough patience and courage to see it through. Edmund lived to see his grandchildren grow into their own early years, his health gradually declining in his final seasons, though he remained sharp and gently affectionate until the very end, often calling for Clara simply to sit beside him in his study, the same room where he had first shown her the faded portrait that changed both their lives so completely. In his final days, he told her once more how grateful he remained for the birthmark that had caught his attention that ordinary afternoon in the nursery, how such a small, simple detail had ultimately unraveled years of loss and silence, restoring to him the daughter he never knew he had been missing. When Edmund passed peacefully one winter evening, surrounded by Clara and her family, the entire county mourned a duke remembered not merely for his lands and title, but for the remarkable story of reconciliation that had defined his final years, a story that continued to be told and retold long after his passing, inspiring others facing their own family hardships to hold on to hope that truth, however long delayed, could still eventually find its way into the light. Clara took up her full responsibilities as Duchess in the years that followed, governing Ashcombe Hall and its lands with the same fairness and quiet strength that had carried her through every hardship she had faced since that first frightening afternoon when a grieving duke had stormed into her cottage demanding answers she did not yet possess. She never forgot the woman she had once been, the simple widow of Hollowbrook who had known nothing of dukes or inheritances, and she carried that humble beginning with her always, ensuring that the tenants and staff of Ashcombe Hall were treated always with the same kindness and respect she herself had once longed for during her most uncertain days within those very walls.